Hello everyone, and welcome to video lesson number 2 of week 3 of inorganics. Now, inorganics, from what we learned before, is a lot of using your polygon modifier, your edge modifier, to play around and adjust things, add new polygons to your low poly model especially. This week is rather short on lessons because we're going to focus on more of your development skills with edit poly and working on a low poly model to get the high res mesh look. From our last video, we know now how to make something look smoother with lower polygons by moving the vertexes and edges closer to the edges that you want little smoothing, and to make anything that needs to be really smooth, make the edges and the vertexes further apart. So our lesson and our final assignment for this week will be building a gun, a common Glock, which is common in most video games. And we're going to be building that in low res, and then using Turbo Smooth and Mesh Smooth to build our high res version out of our low res mesh. Now, for this lesson, we're going to have to be making an image plane inside of 3D Studio Max so we can work via references. I've provided 4 different images for you to use. This one right here, which shows the inside of a Glock. This one right here, which shows the breakdown of a Glock. All the little mechanisms and components that make a Glock fire. This image right here, which we're just using as a reference of another 3D Glock from an angle point of view. And this image right here, which we'll use as our image plane because it's the most accurate to what we want and how we can put together our Glock very easily. So if you'd like to also as well, I'll provide a link that will show you the website for the Glock, which actually provides accurate measurements inside 3D Studio Max. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build a Glock, change the measurements inside of 3D Studio Max, add the image plane, and we're going to start building our low poly mesh out. And we're going to build it out of different parts, different meshes to build up this. We're going to build up 5 components. The clip, the base part of the gun, the firing and slide mechanisms, and the actual sliding top right here. Now, if you place it all together, you can see, even from images like here, that this nub here, this will go in here, this can slide back on top of this. And if you'd like to look up firing videos of a Glock, of course, online, you'll notice that the top part slide here slides back when it fires. We need to make sure that a bullet can fly out of the side here. See right here, this one has this metal clip right here. We got to make sure a bullet can fly out of this when it slides back, etc., etc. So we're going to start with the first step is to actually build out our image plane inside of 3D Studio Max. So to do that, I'm actually just going to go to my front view and I'm going to create a plane. And you need to do this as well. It'll be the exact same specifications, so follow along if you can. I'm going to build out a plane inside of 3D Studio Max. Next step, I'm going to push M to go to my material editor, like so. So the material editor here opens up a brand new window which has the material types on the left-hand side. In the middle here, we have the viewport, so we can see all our material nodes. And on the right-hand side, it shows all our parameters for our materials. It works like 3D models, except we're playing around with materials itself. What I'd like you to do is go to Material Browser, go down to Materials, Scanline, Standard. Double-click on a standard material, and you'll get a standard material inside of 3D Studio Max. Now, the first thing I want you to do is to click on the actual model inside of 3D Studio Max, then click on the material, right-click on the material, and assign material to selection. Your plane now turns gray, which means that it is associated with this model, and you can notice by the little white tick marks on the edge of this box here, I double-clicked on the sphere to make it slightly bigger, that if I click on this model, those tick marks on the side actually go white, which means that this model is associated with this texture. I'm going to rename this texture by going to the right-hand side navigator, and where it says material number whatever, we can just name this reference. So this is now the reference material. So if we look down our actual node here, I can see ambient color, diffuse color, spec color, all the different texture maps we can put onto our model. What I'd like to do is put on a diffuse color, which is pretty much just color, just the straight image that you want to put on top of any model. Double click on the sphere. It's going to ask you what material or map you want to load into that slot. Click on bitmap. Bitmap means you're going to load an image from your computer every time. Then find the image of the actual gun. Now before you double click on the image of the gun from the side view, what I'd like you to do is write down this, 2048 by 1365. That's going to be really important, so always look at statistics because we're actually going to change the number size of this plane to match these numbers here. 2048, 1365. I click open. The first thing I'm going to do is go to my image plane, and I'm going to rename this 2048 by 1365. 2048, 1365. So you notice it makes quite a big image. Then you can scale it down however much you want. I'm just going to scale it down like this. You'll notice that even though I'm scaling this image, it's staying the same length and width. That's because that's the length and width I designed for it. I'm just scaling it down to match something I can play around with in 3D Studio Max a little bit easier. Currently, Max is using meters, but we can go to the top bar here, go to Customize, Configure Units Setup right here, and I'm going to change this to centimeters. Maybe millimeters, actually. Let's go with millimeters. And you can see this is quite big in millimeter size. You can move the period dot over as much as you want as well. But I'm just going to leave it about here. And we can resize it later. So even though our material here, the reference material we have, is associated to our model, the image that we have, which you double click on this image, you can see it's the gun, is not showing up on our current image plane. That's because we have to right click on our reference material here and click Show Shaded Material in Viewport. Show Shaded Material in Viewport. And we're going to see that the gun image actually pops up here, which works well for us to design from. So basically, and to go over those steps one more time, I created a standard material. I double clicked it to pop up all the material parameters. I renamed the material what I wanted to, which was reference. I'll rename this one reference too. You can either double click diffuse, the sphere beside diffuse color here, or click on this little box beside diffuse here, which will want to load a material or map. You click on bitmap, double click, load an image from wherever you want as a reference. Make sure to write down these numbers at the very bottom where it says statistics, 2048, 1365. Make sure that you change your image plane size to match it so that what happens is you're making sure that your texture is scale to the image plane. It doesn't matter how many segments it has. I'll put 1, 1. And you can see that now we have a 1 polygon model in our scene that now works as a reference for our modeling of the gun. So, with that image plane now in our scene, and these materials now associated, I can just click M to close the material editor. And I'm going to go to my layer manager here. I'm going to make sure that this plane 001, if we go to the right hand side, or we can use our layer manager and left click twice on it, I'm going to rename this plane reference. So this is now renamed reference. Now we have our reference image inside of 3D Studio Max that we can work from. I'm going to move it a bit back from the center. So it was here at one point when we created it. It was more like here. I'm just moving it a little back because anytime in 3D Studio Max you want to create a model in any viewport, it'll try and appear around the middle of the grid. So if I move this back, I know that I can always safely create models and it be far away from the actual reference image. So I do that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this reference image, go to Object Properties, and I'm going to go turn off Show Frozen in Gray and turn off Renderable. That means anytime I render the scene, you'll never see the reference image, and I can also freeze it. And I'm unable to select it, but I can always see it in my scene with the texture on from the front view. I'm going to turn off G to turn off my grids here. I don't really think I need the grids for anything, so I'm going to put Z, 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 Z. There we go. And now we have our reference to work from. So basically, since we're splitting this down into 5 parts, the reason why I said 6 parts is not only do we have the clip, we have this main body of the gun, we also have these 3 parts here, and I'd like you to model a bullet as well if you have spare time. If you do not have the time to model a bullet, do not worry. I'd like you to model these parts. Now, I will be providing more reference images. I showed you the 4 I'll be providing, but I'll be providing about 5 or 6 more. I'm going to get started, and I'm going to show you how I would model the top part here and the clip, and the gun I'm going to leave up to you so that you can decide how that will best look for you in your model. So I'm going to work by a reference image of this Glock here. I might try and find another Glock image and angle. Let's see if I look on Google really quick. My apologies. Let's see, Glock. There we go. Perfect. There are different models of Glock too, so don't be afraid if you look up a different model of Glock that it just looks slightly different. But I'm going to see this model right here, this image right here. So I'm just doing this because the top part of the actual clip itself, this is a Glock 37, this is a Glock 43. They're very similar. So I know that the model design will probably be very similar. I could see I need to model pretty much a big square here. I can probably just chamfer the edges here to get this look. I need to extrude this front part here. I need to make a hole here so that this spring can pop out the front. Not pop out. What it does is it slides. This little cap appears at the very end and actually slides back on this spring. And then we can put that all together. And then for these numbers and stuff like that, that's going to be on the texture, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. You can even boolean it out afterwards when you're completely done your model. So that'll be fine for me. So I'm going to get started on that. And I'm going to move my reference slightly off screen here, and I'm going to get started on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a box that will cover this entire size. I'm going to guess it's pretty much even on both sides. I have 130 length, 132 in the height, and so far it's a box. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to check out my model behind here, and I may add just a delete. I'm going to actually delete this polygon at the very bottom. And I'm going to add a chamfer modifier to it. I'm going to change the color here so maybe it's slightly more visible to you. And hopefully push F4. There you go. Now you can hopefully see it better. I'm going to add a chamfer modifier to it right here. Now, if the chamfer modifier doesn't work for you in this mode, ideally what I'd like you to do is change the type of mode you're looking at. So I'm going to add the chamfer modifier here. Maybe something like this. Really tiny, really tiny right now. I'm going to do a test render. We can change our render setup early on so we can see what it looks like in a render. I'm going to turn to, I just turned render setup. I went down to output size, turned it to HDTV, put it at 1920 by 1080, and now I can get a much bigger render. And I might change the background color by going to rendering environment. And we're going to change the color of that to maybe like a gray type area right here, like so. So this is a really small chamfer. Now, ideally what I can do is I can actually just delete this and create my own chamfer. And then go to Edit Poly Edge Mode, grab all the edges I want to chamfer, go to the chamfer tool here, and then I can create a much softer chamfer myself just by playing around with these parameters. Things come out a little better looking when I do it that way. Change your smooth type, smooth everything. Now you can see I have a much smoother look to my model all around here. Now it ends up being less smooth down here because I actually have no polygons down here. And the reason why I want that is because it's actually pretty sharp here, and then it turns into a different model down the middle. So what I'm going to do next is, because I'm looking at my gun reference here, I'm going to actually slice plane down the middle a couple of times. I could probably, let's see if we can get away with Swift Loop. Looks like I can get away with Swift Loop. And I can hold Shift so it cuts directly in the middle. I can hold these sides here. And I have some loops I can play around with. I'm running into a couple issues, so I'm actually going to back up a couple steps, and not delete the bottom polygon. I feel like that's maybe running into some issues for me. We're going to play around with really low poly first, and then we're going to chamfer edges. So sometimes you make mistakes like that, and even I make mistakes like that trying to plan out my actual shape. And trust me, it does happen quite often. So I'm just backing out a few steps. So if you want to back out a few steps, or you like going along with the early chamfer, then please do. For me, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this shape here, And I want to cut out the basic shapes first. So what I'm going to do is I see that this part down here, this loop, is actually coming from this model itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Edit, the Swift Loop here. I'm going to Swift Loop something really in front. If I go to my front view here, I'm going to Swift Loop it about here. If I can click it, that would be great. And Swift Loop, there. Right, it's not working for some reason. Oh, it is. Oh, geez. I could barely see it. Polygon, Edit, Swift Loop. And there. There we go. So now I know that if I go to F4 on my keyboard, I have a Swift Loop, and I can obviously change that and move it to where I need to, which would be roughly there. Great. So next step is I know that this has a little nub coming out from the top, so I'm going to put another Swift Loop. So I'm going to Swift Loop over here. And then I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to add a Swift Loop here and here. My next step is I'm going to make one directly down the middle. Now, you'll notice that things like Swift Loop, if I hold Shift and go down the middle, if I hold the Shift key, might run into some issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to Swift Loop, find the center position by holding Shift, but I'm just going to let go of Shift just right before I click it, just so it doesn't do that little extrusion problem. There you go. And now I know that's directly down the middle of my model, I hope. I'll have to do it again one more time. Like that. There we go. There we go. So now I have a Swift Loop right down the middle, and I'm going to add one here. Really close. Close. Right there. And right there. The reason why I'm adding these loops around the model is because I'm going to extrude the aim in the front, the actual sight coming out the front. And what I can do to extrude this little sight is I can actually extrude this shape here. But you'll notice that it actually pops up and then it slides down. So always just play around with your views. I'm going to go to the side view here. I'm going to play around with the vertexes to make sure it matches up like that. I'm going to grab these two vertexes on top. I'm going to use the scale tool to flatten them out. And you can see we got our nice little aim happening right there. So if I render this out right now, we get a really simple gun top. Okay, now I'm going to keep going. Go to the next step. And this one is a little different than the front. This one actually has spacing beside it. So there's two things you can do at this point. And the one thing you can do is, since this top part of the gun is symmetrical, you can delete half of it. And we can mirror it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete half this top part of the gun. I'm going to go to my third menu, Hierarchy, Effect Pivot Only, to adjust this pivot point right to the side where I want it to mirror. So I want it to mirror from here. I'm going to go to Tools, Mirror, Reference, and I'll move it to the Y-axis, or whatever axis works for you. And now I have two sides of a gun, so anything I do to one side of the gun will be even and work accurately to the other side of the gun. So what I have to do is make the little aim sight in the back. So you can see if I do this and go to my front view here, I can scale and adjust it so that I can put it right there. And if I go to perspective, we now have a gun with a little sight in the back, little sight in the front, and we can adjust these vertexes however we see fit from the top view. So if you feel like maybe your aim in the front needs to be a little bit more scaled down, these two in the back need to be a little scaled as well, then by all means adjust, render, and see how they look like, and that's looking pretty good so far. So ideally what I'd like to do at this point is I'm going to do a front chamfering, and then I'm going to make a new cut here to cut the loop for our gun. So if I go to my reference image here, we can see that we need this loop So I'm going to make sure that my two next steps is I'm going to get this nice chamfered look to the front of the gun here and across here down to the back and down this side here. And then I want to get this loop in the gun. And then I'll worry about cutting the holes maybe with a Boolean tool afterwards to get this nice shape. And if I don't want to use the Boolean tool, ideally I can use something else to get this kind of shape going on. But it looks like I also need to extrude too. So what I should do is I should extrude this outwards a little bit, then pop everything out just a little bit. So these two guns do look a little different, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. But first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add another Swift loop, edit Swift loop. So we have this. My next step is to grab these polygons here, and I'm going to extrude them downwards, like so. So to get this shape of this actual gun here, we need to keep rounding it up. So we need to extrude and move, extrude and move, extrude and move. And so that's exactly what I'm about to do. My next steps will be slight extrusions and moving. I'll go into my left view here and I'll worry about doing so. I'll go to my perspective view just for a second so I can do a few small extrusions. Grab these underneath here. And I'm going to extrude, extrude, extrude. Now there's two different ways of doing this. You see I'm doing it this way where I'm extruding it and trying to get the actual shape out. But here's another thing I can do. I can delete this. And you'll see I got this empty spot here. I want the edge here still there because if you look at our reference image, we still have this spacing that we need to have for our gun to wrap around as well. So here's what I can do. And this might work in our favor. Is I'm going to actually go to my left view right now. I'm going to create a cylinder here. And that gives me a nice rounded edge all the way through for the bottom part of my gun. So this is the bottom part of the gun here. And I know now how many polygons I will use. And I just add a cap segment here. Maybe I'll add 3. It doesn't really matter how many cap segments you add as long as it matches up the general shape. Because what I'm going to do, I'll create a split down the middle. So if I add, I'll turn this to 1 segment. And then I will increase the side amount until I get this. There you go. Convert to edit poly. And what I end up with at the end, I get this nice shape here. So this shape, what I ideally want it to do is I'm going to expand, let's say this inward slightly. And move this like that. And I'm actually going to detach, delete all these on top. I'm going to detach, delete these. And I'm going to move everything to the front where I need it to be, right here. And I'm going to delete these polygons in the back. And move these vertexes forward. So with this kind of modeling, it is very often, a lot of trial and error. You see what I'm doing? I'm just cleaning it up, trying to make sure everything is flattened together in the front so that it matches up to our model here. Because what's going to happen is I'm going to weld this all together to get the front part of my gun. And you can see here, that'll make the nice rounded shape that I'm looking for. Now this is the outer part. That's going to be for the base of the gun. This is the inner part I'm going to want for the top part of my gun. So what I need to do is create another slice plane here. We're increasing the poly count, but don't worry about that too much. We have a ton of polygons to play with. I'm going to add a Swift loop to connect it about here. Okay. Looking good. So our next step right now is to delete and detach polygons. I'm going to make sure that this is a clean mesh, and I notice that if I push F3, there's some hidden polygons over here. I delete those. My next step is to detach these. These will be used for the base of my gun. So for this bottom part of my gun here, this part that wraps around the siding here. I will use this later on, so I will detach this and I will call it base gun. And you can keep it a different color. What we're going to do with this is we're actually going to attach this in a second to the top part of our gun to create that nice loop shape that we're looking for. Now you're going to notice that we do have edges that aren't matching to these. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to Edit, Polygon. And since we can't add a Swift loop here, I'm actually going to cut those loops in. So I'm going to go to Polygon, I'm going to go to Cut, and you can see I'm just going to trace small shapes from here. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a nice edge flow, because what's going to happen is it's going to rotate to the other side and loop all the way around. And that's exactly what edge looping is. We want to keep a consistent flow between our models. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze this here. Make sure these are all flattened with my blue part. Looks good. And I go to my original model. I go to Polygon, Attach here. And you can see we're getting now the front part of our gun together like this. So there is a lot of welding that needs to go on, a lot of moving of the vertices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all my vertices in the middle, the very center of my model, like so. I'm going to squeeze them all together by using the scale tool. And then I'm going to move them so that both lines intersect. That's one, this line is from the reference model, this line is from our original model. I'm just moving them together so that they're nice and together. So when I do a render, they look like they're actually the same object. And I'll have to weld these at the very bottom here. So what I'll do is I'll use actually what's called the target weld tool. Target weld will force one vertex to move up to meet up another vertex. So if I'm in Edit Poly Vertex mode, I go to my Vertices ribbon menu, and there's Target Weld. I left click on that, which means Target Weld mode is on. I left click on my original vertex, and there's a little line that forms, and then I left click on the other vertex. And I can keep doing that. I can keep combining these objects, and they will match up. Like that. Now this is still low polygon count, so you don't need to worry too much. When we smooth it together and everything looks great, we can create a nice flow with everything. So it's just a matter of adjusting your vertexes and making sure everything flows at least decently well. It's not going to be too perfect right away, but we're going to keep working on it as we go. You can see there was some hidden polygons here that are causing issues. An easy way to get rid of hidden polygons that are in the center of models is I grab a model like this, I hold Alt and grab all the polygons that I see that are highlighted that should be visible, and I just click the delete key and it deletes any hidden polygons. And now, we get a relatively flat model to where we can squish it all together and everything work out. And then we just weld vertexes when we need to and move vertexes how we feel like the flow should be going. And so far, yeah, this looks pretty good. Like that. So now we have the bottom part of our gun. We can hide this base part of our gun, or you can start working on it if you really want to get the entire low poly base shape of the gun as well. But I'm going to hide this for now because what I want to do is I want to build the thickness of this part outwards. So I'm going to go to edge mode. I'm going to grab these edges here, extrude them backwards like this. And you can start moving these polygons to meet these polygons in the back here. Now, normally if I want polygons to meet up with each other, I count how many polys are, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll extrude 1, 2, 3, 4. So grab 4. And then I will flatten them out using the scale tool. Excuse me, drag them up like that. And I will start go to vertex mode, vertices, target weld. 1. Oops, my apologies, wrong one. Vertices, target weld, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I can just go to my front view here. I'm going to use my vertex tool, grab all these vertexes here, and then flatten them all out to make sure everything is nice and flat. Do the same for the front to make sure everything is nice and flat. That way, once I go into perspective mode, everything is completely flat. And we can change our smoothing groups for this side here to make this look nice and smooth. One, two, three, four. Smoothing group 30. So far, so good. So my next step will be to cut one more edge up here in the top part of the gun. If I'm looking at this Glock in particular, this Glock is more flat and it just has more of a rounded top. This Glock I'm looking at has more like a small protrusion. I can mix and match how I see fit. I can always add a new swift loop here. And then judging from this reference, I see that this is all pretty much an extrusion together. So maybe I'll extrude all these parts out. It looks like the swift loop will take over. I need to add a minor swift loop to the corner here. Maybe add one there. So you can see how much detail we're adding to our model. It's not really adding a lot of detail. When we start swift looping it, you're going to start seeing that it's actually going to smooth in the right locations. We need to adjust our smoothing groups, but so far these edges look like they'll be smoothed out okay. Some more adjustments, after I chamfer it, that'll be important, etc., etc. This is going to take some time. I'm obviously doing a bit of a push job on this, just to show you how to build up your basic low poly. You don't need to worry so much about the high res when it comes to modeling this. I'd suggest to really just focus and narrow down on the low res version of this model first before you start focusing on the high poly, because we really need to make sure that high poly looks good first. So basically my next step here is I'm going to go to Polygon. I'm going to go expand this up just a little bit. Maybe I'll grab this entire row and push it up just slightly. I go my front view, make sure I grab it all, and I move these all up just a little bit. You can see I'm starting to do that edge thing, right? Where all these polygons, all these vertices are going towards the edge. And ideally what I should do here as well is I should make an edge loop. Go in with the rest of the model here as well. There's a loop that was created here. I should be creating loops that match each other. So this is where edge looping matters. We want to try and make sure that all our loops work together. So these two vertexes are now welded. So now if they turbo smooth, that'll turbo smooth much better than it did before. Once we separate by smoothing groups. Everything's a different smoothing group right now except for the stuff I extruded. But you can see we get a smoother look here. Smoother look some other stuff. So with turbo smooth on, it looks like this with the different smoothing groups. So it's just a matter of me assigning the different smoothing groups now to where I need it. And obviously doing chamfers and stuff like that. Because if I start chamfering, I have a low poly amount. Remember, you can hold, double click on one of the edges. We'll grab the entire edge loop. Or you can go here and grab loop. And what it'll do is it'll grab the entire edge loop all around the model, as much as it can see. And then I'll go and grab all the vertexes that it didn't grab. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually going to chamfer it slightly and see what we can get as a result. So I'm going to grab these, and I'm going to click chamfer. So you can see I can get this slight chamfer, which isn't too bad. Because I added so many edges already, you can see I'm kind of overlapping against all the edges I've created. It's only going to allow me to create this small chamfer. But don't worry so much about that. You can go around and edit that later as well. You can weld these vertices together and change that. So just a couple of hints as we're building out this low poly model. We need to get these edges on the side in, of course, as well. We need to add turbo smooth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe make these a part of the same group just to show you what turbo smooth looks like on a model like this. Yeah, we can clear this. So that's what turbo smooth is looking like on this model so far. And if I add different groups to it and I go, this is group 11, I turn on turbo smooth. This one's group 9, 33. Since it's a very hard surface model, it shouldn't have actually too many smoothing groups. You just really want to refine the edges. And like I said, don't worry about your smoothing groups too much at the start. It's basically going to be a lot of low polygon work first. So just start building out the actual size of the gun. Yeah, I gave you this Glock because it is a lot less detailed than other Glocks. So you should be able to come up with something. And even here, you can see like it's more rounded at the top too. So an easy thing to do for this Glock would actually be to lower it slightly. And then from our edge loops that we've created, we can go to the left view and I can just start increasing the curve of these just by going to right here, go to soft selection, use soft selection. I'm going to change the distance of soft selection to about 110 millimeters, it looks like. And you see I'm going to add that slight curve just like that. I turn off soft selection and I can start modifying little parts of the gun that I need to. If I think these edges are too close for me to play around with any chamfering, I'm going to pull them away. And maybe I'll use the chamfer tool afterwards to create that detail I need. And I'll do the same for this. Maybe I'll pull this edge away. You don't have to worry too much about the size of the gun. See, that's looking a lot better already. Once we have that turbo smooth on there, that's looking a lot better, a lot like a gun. There's some modifications I need to make here, which I think has to do more about the smoothing group. So if I grab all these polygons at the very bottom, Alts, and I'm going to change their smoothing group to 8. Yeah, you can see I just corrected that issue. And now we got a nice soft side as well. So it does take some time to figure this out. Of course, even as I'm going, I'm starting to see like little errors and things to fix. And before I add my booleans, I'm going to collapse this model. A lot of this is hard surface, so I can just grab models and I go, okay, this is smoothing group 8. And then maybe it's too soft here in the front, so I'm going to change this to 7. And that doesn't look too bad. But maybe the back of those need to be turned into a different group as well. So I go to these, and I turn it to 15. And you can see you get this nice look here to the model. And you get that nice soft part of the gun. Remember that if the back of the gun needs to be a lot harsher than the sides of the gun, just change the smoothing group type. And then you can always go to your edges here, turn off turbo smooth, and you can manually just grab this. I'll grab these edges here. Like that, and maybe I'll add my own chamfer to it. And you can see that even in low poly, it's okay. And if I add that turbo smooth, it looks good. Yeah. So it's just taking it slowly and steady. Like for instance, if you wanted to create these ridges on the side, I know most of you are thinking about that. What I like to do is normally I'll pull away the model for a second, and then I'll look at these ridges. I'll go to my actual model that I'm working on, and I'll slice plane where I need to across the side to match the location of those ridges I'm going to make. Remember, don't forget that we have the angle snap tool up here. If you click that and then start rotating, it rotates by 5 degrees every time. I turn it off because I have the right rotation. And I had the wrong rotation now. Let's turn that back on. Right here, like this. And we move it. And we're going to start slicing where these are. I'm going to turn off my high poly here. I'm going to slice, 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 slice. And, you can create slice after slice after slice just to make sure that we get this nice look where they're going for. Slice, slice, and slice. And the last one will be pretty much exactly where the back trigger is. You can either create new slices through this if you really want to. We can, just like this. One new slice through there, and then I can weld the top vertices right there. These two together, or I can just leave them like that. It's up to me. They do loop well, so it doesn't really matter at this time. So it's okay. And then we can just use the extrusion or bevel tool. We can go in, and I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to grab these, push F4 on the keyboard. Grab this. And now I can make those pushes inside my 3D model. I can go even higher. If I think these are higher than that, I go this. I use my extrude tool, or I can use the bevel tool. Ideally, what I'd like to do is use the extrude tool a little bit. And what I'm going to do, while these are all selected, I'm just going to scale them down slightly, just like that. So what I get is a gun that I can push down like this. Like that. And you can see I get those nice ridges in the side of the gun. Now these are on both sides of the gun, so that works for me. You're going to have to adjust your smoothing groups as well in these models, because if you turbo smooth, you're going to run into something like this. So we will have to add something like swift loops through it, or inset them just slightly. Change the smoothing group number. So if I go click on these, like this, and I change the smoothing group number here, I change it from 1. I'm going to make it to 20. You can see we still run into that issue, right? And that's because of lack of detail. But if I add an inset, then change the inset amount, of course, it becomes a little less rounded. But then, so what we should do ideally is we'd have to change things on the outside here. Maybe I'll scale these in slightly. Like that. And you can add a loop all around the inside of this model here. And change the smoothing group number again of these on the outside. So this is going to require some fine tuning, of course. It's going to be a little bit of chamfering that we need to do. So we'll go through that as we go through it. But like I said, ideally at first, just work with your turbo smooth. You might not even need a turbo smooth or mesh smooth if you throw enough polygon detail into the low res mesh. For this situation, I actually might just smooth out the sides because it might be less of a hassle, and I might just leave it as is with nice rounded edges, and then I'll boolean out the front. If you forget how to boolean out the front, it's pretty simple. Just a last note about creating this part. Let's say that this is pretty much complete. Don't forget that you need to add the part where the bullets come out of, which seems to be on the right-hand side of the gun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these polygons here, and I'm going to add a slice plane. Now, this is if you're done every other part of the gun and you're about to get onto the clip part. About to get on the bullet ejector part. You slice plane, sure, like you normally do. But we're not going to make the actual shape of the whole exit hole for the bullets to come out of, because if we do, it's going to appear on both sides of the gun. So what we want to do when we get to this point, and let's say we're finished and we're about to boolean the holes out and we're about to put the ejector hole, is we grab both parts of the model, we convert to edit poly, and what you can do, and because this will automatically weld it for you, it might make it a little bit easier, is make sure that your pivot point is like right where this model is going to mirror itself, and you're going to add a modifier called symmetry. Symmetry just works like the mirror tool does, except it actually goes with your model, your current model, the way it is. And we can adjust it, we can flip it, we can slice along mirror, we can tell it to weld the seams automatically, and we can give it a measurement, or we can tell it not to weld the seams, and we can collapse it. And you can see we get an exact duplicate right beside each other, but not welded right now, which is fine. We're going to leave it unwelded for now. We're just going to create the ejector side here for the actual gun part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these, and I'm going to do maybe an inset on these first. Just a slight inset like that. And I will extrude inwards. Adjust your extrusion so it looks correct. Remember that we have reference images for that. We have one that looks like this. Yours doesn't have to look like that. It can look much, much different. Some ejectors look completely empty, but most of the time they are covered with a small metal lock. This will actually cover your ejection slot. You can see it in the detail breakdown that this would actually be pushed up in here, and you'll see this metal part on the side. So we can just delete this. So we extrude this out, and we can delete that like that, and leave that hole there, so that we can do our slight adjustments. This is pushing too far in. I'm going to push this back out a bit. And by the time we create that metal bar, that looks okay. And you can do your adjustments here. You can weld polygons, weld vertices if you need to. I weld these here. Weld these three. Like that. You can use your scale tool if you want to grab these vertexes here. I'm going to scale them all together so that they appear really flat. It looks like I grabbed some other vertexes by accident. There we go. Vertexes here. And I go here and I grab these vertexes. Here, I uncheck these. If you want to, you can hold Control and select more vertexes, grab them, and scale. And there you go. You now have an empty gun hole on the side of your gun, so that when your gun slides back, it can eject the bullets out. We have our eye sight. We have our iron sight here for this gun. So what you can do for the front is you can create that boolean now for the hole in the front of the gun by just using a cylinder, and we can go to the front part of the actual gun itself. You can make this very high res if you'd like, so I can increase the sides however many I like, or you can make it low res, whatever you'd like to work in. For instance, my gun is actually pretty accurate so far, so I'm not going to sacrifice too many polygons. I'm going to make this 16-sided, which is still relatively low res, but high res enough where it looks like it can actually be a full-on barrel to a gun. And I will create the size of the actual hole I think will work for our gun here. So I'm going to create one for this, and I'm going to create a small one for the bottom part of the gun, because as you notice, the bottom part of our gun, if you look by our reference images, front part of our gun here, we have this hole in the front that we need to pop the mechanism out of, right? So we have this hole in the front here that our mechanism needs to pop up. This one's a little bit wider. So these ones can actually be pretty wide sometimes. And I will put it about this size here. I think is fairly accurate. I actually might make it just slightly smaller, so it fits the bottom there. You're allowed to be a little bit creative with this. You can adjust it and change it up as much as you want. Obviously, if you can be very accurate with it, you can look up the measurements on the Glock website, and you can go by those measurements specifically if you're really finicky for being accurate like crazy. That's absolutely fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this part of the gun. I'm going to use this. I'm going to give it a compound object, create geometry compound objects, a Boolean tool. What a Boolean tool does is allows you to cut an object using another object. Meaning if I click Boolean while I have the gun top part in my grasp right now selected, I click Boolean, that's the main object that appears in my scene, which is called box 001. Now it's on union mode, so if I were to add another operand, which means another object in the scene, and I click on this, what happens is it's unifying both of them. You can see the cylinder that I just selected was also in union mode. However, I can change that by clicking on a different operand parameter. I can make it intersect, which means it's only going to show the part that intersects both models, or I can make it subtract. And you can see we now have a hole in my 3D model that matches the hole for the gun. We will have to cut some edges out to match the edge flow, but that won't be too much of an issue. Cut 1, 2, and everything else actually flows actually quite well. So I think we'll be really fine for that. Shouldn't be an issue at all. So this is a good reason to use the Boolean tool. And then we can also add more operands. For instance, I can add this cylinder as well. And then this cylinder is on union mode as well, but I can also turn that to subtract mode. And you can see I also have that subtracted completely out as well. And then I can now go to my modifier list and I can collapse everything. So I can turn this all into an editable poly. And now it is one object, editable poly. And I can now play around with it and modify it as I see fit. So what I should do is correct some of the issues that I see in my model. At the front here, I see that there is a couple. This is probably created because these vertexes are here hanging around. So I weld this one. And I make sure that everything is kind of welded together. So I go to vertex weld. I'm going to preview what it looks like when I weld at 0.1 millimeters. 0.8, 1. You can kind of see it, you can kind of see how everything welds. And I kind of usually like to pick like just small amounts. And right now we're at 1.9, and you can see we run into issues where vertexes are overlapping each other. So don't worry about welding too far apart. I'd always suggest to work in 0 points. So 0.1, 0.3. So we're at 0.3 right now. And it's just a matter of changing your smoothing groups. So basically the front part of this gun at the very bottom here, I would actually change into one smoothing group for itself. So I'd grab this part of the gun, and this would be smoothing group. All should be one number. And right now I see that's actually 3 different numbers. But if I change this to 16, you can see that already looks way better down here. And I just need to keep going through my model and changing the smoothing groups. If I go to the front part of my gun and I click, you'll notice that this is actually 4 different smoothing groups now, which is pretty crazy. So if I just select the front part of my gun, even with the bottom part here selected as well, I select this entire front part, I can probably actually make this all, one smoothing group. And there, that looks a lot better already. And then I can add the extra details. If my gun needed to pop out slightly like this, I can just use the extrude tools and change that. And you can see that we need to cut some edges too, or weld some vertices together. If I go to vertex mode, you can see there's some vertices that are like literally right beside each other. You can just go to the weld tool, change it to a high number, and start welding these a little closer together. If there's 2 vertexes that are really, really close, there's no point in having them too far apart. I'm just going to weld them like so. Weld, 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 weld. There's 2 here, weld those. 2 here, weld those. And that looks like it should be fine. And I'll cut these to match the edges here. So what I'll do is I'll go here, grab my cut tool here. It's okay if you have a few triangles in your model. This model is pretty flat in the front. I don't need to do anything crazy to it. So, and that's all I really need to do. See, I create a nice circle, and all I need to do is cut these little 4 lines here. They flow into these edges here, and that's it. Because they don't need to be too crazy, it managed to work out just fine, actually. I'm going to go to border mode. I'm going to grab this border. Since it's hollow on the inside, it's considered a border. Extrude it just ever so slightly to create a cap for the gun. And then I'm just going to extrude this backwards. Like so. And now we create the barrel of our gun. Don't forget your smoothing groups on the inside of the gun as well. And you can see we have the front part of the barrel of our gun. And for these right here, you can see we have this empty hole here. Well, that's not going to do. If I grab both these borders and make sure that all the vertex points are welded where I want them to be welded and cut where I need to be cut. So obviously I have a little bit of work to do back here with my smoothing groups and the cutting. I got to take that little bit of extra time. Adjust these smoothing groups. See, already looks 100 times better. I grab both these borders and I will just create a bridge. So borders, and then I click bridge. And you can see it automatically tries to create the best bridge possible. And don't forget that sometimes border may grab an extra edge or two. Just deselect these edges. You can see I got edges here, so that means I need to probably do a little bit of welding. And then I'm going to go to bridge. I'm running into a couple issues, probably because there's some borders that need to be welded still. Oh, it's these. If you look at the front here, there was polygon vertexes so close to each other that I didn't even see them lined up here. I'm just gonna weld all these together like so. There's even a couple hanging out here. They're gonna need to cut. So let's zoom out a bit. So the same thing we did for the top hole in our model. We find vertexes that are really, really close. We can weld those together. Any ones that are kind of hanging out in space a little far away, we can then cut to match it close to the closest edge possible. But try and match any vertices that are just floating in space in nowhere. Try and get them as close as possible as matching other vertexes, and you're going to see a lot cleaner meshes. So a lot of inorganic work is exactly what I'm doing right now. It's a lot of just cleaning up and making sure you're accurate with your model to what you're trying to make. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just sort of making sure that there's no vertexes floating out in the middle of nowhere. I know if there are vertexes floating in the middle of nowhere, like this one here, I need to eventually cut it to an edge so that it actually flows into something. Could be anything. And then that helps me build out things like bridges and stuff like that. You can see just with the slight work, that bridge worked out a lot better than it did previously before. And now if I render out our model, we have that nice bridge there. We have the nice front part of our gun. We have the nice sides of our gun. I change the smoothing group here, and we'll eventually have the finished part of the top part of my gun, and you can move on to the other parts of the gun. Now, don't forget that this also, the bottom part of the gun, is empty as well, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to grab the entire bottom part of the gun. I'm going to go to my front view here. So what I do is I grab the entire bottom part. I hold Alt to deselect everything on the top part here. And you see that I should have the entire bottom selected. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to inset it just slightly. Like this. Inset like that. I'm going to extrude it upwards. This is to create a little bit of depth so that if our gun slides off, we can still see these polygons here in a game situation. And we can also increase one side more than the other one. So for instance, we know that we have a hole here, so we can't increase the metal side of that one too high. But on this side, we actually can. We don't increase everything all the way high. But if I increase, let's say, this much, that high, that means that if I see the gun slide back, I can actually, it looks like there's an actual wall there. Put it all the way up here. So if I see it at an angle like this, it looks like there's actually an inside to the actual gun itself, giving the illusion that there is a working parts on the inside and that it's not low poly, that it's actually a real life object. And you can see we're only at 1,000 polygons. The average first-person shooter has about oh man, I can't even start naming it now. I'd say roughly between 8,000 and 30,000 polygon first-person shooter models. So you have a ton of detail and ton of work that you can put into these. Don't be afraid to take your time to make sure that they actually look good and work well for what you want. You see I can just did a small tweak there. You see I grabbed a polygon here. I'm changing the smoothing group of this one to 13. So I get a nice smoothing group. I'll do the same thing for anything that doesn't have a smoothing group, like this on the side here. This will be smoothing group 26. And maybe I'll do the same thing for this one. Maybe this will also be smoothing group 26. And you get that nice soft edge. Or maybe I'll change this to smoothing group 11. I get that nice hard edge on the front there. And you get that nice top part of the gun. So this is what you would pretty much do for the entire model. You'd go around it, make sure the detail's all there. Things like the numbers and letters etched into it, we can add with texture detail. But just take your time and go through different parts of the gun. And I would say if you want only going to finish off a certain parts of the gun, finish the bottom. Don't worry about these little metal bits on the inside, because I know that we barely know how they function. But make this bottom part of the gun, try and make the different, you can use as many meshes as possible. Because remember, a trigger is not welded into a gun. It's a different mechanic, right? So make sure to add the trigger. There's a safety switch. There's a little switch here as well. There's the clip and this top part of the gun. So the clip, the bottom part of the gun, don't worry about this metal stuff on top here, and the top part of the gun. Try and get those models for this Sunday / early Monday. I know this is actually a lot more work than it seems, but you know the tools. Remember your inset, your chamfers, your extrudes, your bevels, your cuts, your slice planes, your swift loops. Those are all important things that you can do. You're going to make mistakes, and you don't have to be afraid to delete over. I made a mistake earlier on in my video. I just kept going, and I worked through it. I backed up a couple steps, and I went forward and did some more, and I actually got a final look that was actually relatively good. And it's something I will continuously work on to make sure that it kind of gets to the perfect step to work with. And that includes, having to change smoothing groups and having to adjust things. You can see I'm still doing adjustments here, changing my smoothing groups over so that everything kind of looks well. And then I can make sure that this moves all the way over to the top of the gun, and then smooth out the edges here, etc., etc. So build out the best gun you can possible. Make sure to take your time with this. If you have any questions at all, email me. Like I said, this week is a little short on videos because it's mostly a work period to try and get your inorganic modeling skills up, because next week we're starting on organic modeling and scene, organic modeling, especially with scenes and stuff like that, and characters. And we're going to learn how proper edge loops work. And if you get a good handle on low poly modeling and you're able to model a gun, then you're already good enough to get in the industry, because this is the kind of experience you need to do. And this will also be good portfolio work for when we get to texturing. You can have a full, good-looking gun. So remember, we want the bottom part of the gun, no metal bits here, but we do want the trigger and the safety and the little handle on the side here, which I believe is the clip release. You want the actual clip, and you want the top part of the gun. A bullet's extra. You don't have to worry about these two little mechanical parts. We probably won't see them too much. We can replace this black bit, which I think it hides the clip entrance. We can replace it with just a block or something like that. It's not an issue. So take your time, make sure this looks good, and if you have any questions, email me at any time, send me a message, ask me, and I'll try and create a custom tutorial for you. I think you guys got this. No biggie. Good luck. Model a Glock. I'll send all the files to you right as I upload this video. Take it easy.